Herzlich willkommen, liebe Zuhörerinnen und Zuhörer, zu unserem Mark in Motion Podcast aus dem Zwischenraum. Mein Name ist Gabriel Schimmeroth und heute spreche ich mit Maria Fernanda Boza Cuadros. I will now change to English because Marfe is our Mark in Motion fellow from Peru, and you literally arrived here in Hamburg in the only possible time slot due to the pandemic, where you could leave Peru and enter Hamburg regarding the flights and so on. And we actually planned a project presentation here at the Zwischenraum. And of course, right now the museum is closed, but also before it was very tricky in organizing bigger events. So we said, okay, we will now have a first kind of getting to know you podcast in a way. And I'm super happy that you joined the conversation.
Thank you.
And we will talk a little bit about the fellowship, about your research, about your plans, about the Zwischenraum also, and what role you will have here in and what role you will play in. And so first, as I said, so you are the third Mark in Motion Fellow. Can you just start and tell us a little bit about your projects and about the research you're doing so far?
Yes. Thank you for having me here. My main research has to do with the trade entanglements between Hamburg and South America. My regional specialization is Peru. And within this, how these commercial entanglements, how is it that the South American collections of the MARKK came into being at the end of the 19th century and the first third of the 20th century is my main temporal focus while I'm here. I'm also working on an exhibit that will open next year in the Zwischenraum, and we're also collaborating with other colleagues in the museum.
Yeah, maybe before going more into the exhibition and your research on the permanent the planned new permanent exhibition, can you tell us a little bit about your professional background? So you're kind of trained as an Andean archaeologist. So just very briefly, what an Andean archaeologist is actually doing in an ethnographic museum, and so maybe a little bit around your daily work and your background, your professional background.
My main specialization now is as a historical and maritime archaeologist. My research the last 6-7 years has been on long distance trade, especially international trade out of Peru in the 19th century, in the post-colonial period. But before that, I was trained as a prehistoric archaeologist. So I'm both familiar with the trade entanglements that came out of Peru specifically, but South America more generally, with Europe after the independence of the South American republics, right, the former Spanish colonies, and also with the archaeological objects that form this collection. And also the questions that people who were in museums like the MARKK in the 19th, 20th century were interested in, right? I'm an anthropological archaeologist, so this is also part of the history of the discipline, the formation of these large ethnographic collections that include antiquities. And so in that sense, an anthropological archaeologist or an archaeologist that, like me, has also a historical training is a good person for this kind of research. We know both the dealings that formed the collection, right, as much as the objects that are part of these collections.
When we're talking about world trade, in a way, we're also always talking about the entanglements between Hamburg and the world, or Hamburg, then in your case in the Americas, or Peru, Chile, whatsoever. And I think it would be interesting if you elaborate a little bit about this kind of specific Hamburg Americas collection relation. Sorry, not also collections, but mainly also the relations. So why it is so specific and why we have so many collections from this part of the world, how they came here, what kind of collectors, but also really on a basic level, this kind of relationship between parts of the Americas and the city of Hamburg, the harbor city of Hamburg.
The harbor city of Hamburg. Well, Hamburg and the traders in Hamburg were very interested in South America as a sort of goal in the competition that different European circles, trading circles had in the first quarter of the 19th century, right? The former Spanish colonies were still seen as very rich areas, areas where a lot of natural resources could be extracted. So Hamburg traders were particularly interested in seeing what they could bring from Peru and also what they could sell back. These regions, these countries, Peru especially, had no manufacturers, for example. So it was both a market that they could sell their manufacturers from Hamburg to, but also bring back products like guano or salpeta or rubber, different natural resources or raw materials throughout time. And as a matter of fact, this is a very dynamic relationship, right? The city of Hamburg is full of markers from this era, like the Chile House, for example, named after Chile, built by one of the Salpeta barons. The same with Volksblock or Laeshalle. And in South America, there are also names of streets like Shell Street in Lima that are connected to these German traders that that connected South America and Hamburg. There's also the fact that a lot of Europeans in general, but also an important number of German explorers traveled around South America in the 19th century. And this was not just a sense of adventure or coming back home and writing your memoirs, but trying to understand what kind of resources or indigenous traditions, indigenous knowledges could be co-opted and then capitalized upon, right? Where these resources were located, where how difficult it would be to export them and extract them, who could work them, right? It's not just a matter of saying, oh, there's a large gold deposit here, who's going to work the mine? So these narratives of the travelers of the 19th century are not just adventures up the Andes and down the Amazon, but they're also very detailed narratives of resources and peoples that might be ready to exploit
So
them.
it's a kind of a prerequisite for the trade and exploitation part. Yeah.
Yes. Know where all this stuff is the first step before you decide to
Information
invest.
management in a way.
Information management.
Could you, because I think when we talk about world trade or something, capitalism linked to it, it always helps when it's a little bit more specific on what kind of products, what kind of, also maybe then also names, which are then linked to special collections also. And I mean, I know that in the last weeks we talked a lot about guano and the guano export, and how this is also linked to our collection. And yeah, maybe you can talk a little bit about this. Anyway, what actually guano is anyway, and how it then might be linked to an ethnographic collection, which is obviously not so self-explaining, right?
Right. So guano is dung in general, but specifically bird dung. And in the early 19th century, Alexander von Humboldt goes to South America, and in Peru, he realizes that indigenous peoples use little amounts of the dung of birds from islands off the coast to fertilize fields, and they have very significant properties. And the guano of on these islands is quite more quite a stronger fertilizer than in other places because it doesn't rain in the coast of Peru. So there's no leaching of the nitrates that are in the guano. And so by the 1840s, this is sort of discovered in Europe, and Peru starts to export enormous amounts of guano that didn't just come to Hamburg. It went a lot to the United Kingdom. It went to the island of Reunion. It starts also a huge exploration wave for islands around the world, right? Bad guano starts to be also mined out of islands in the Pacific. And for Hamburg specifically, we have some artifacts donated by one family that became very rich, the Ollendorfs. But also we have a couple of very interesting artifacts that came out of one of these islands where guano was mined, the island of Maccabi, and is wooden statues dating to the Moche era. We're talking 1500 years ago, give or take. And these represent sacrificial victims or prisoners that are soon to be sacrificial victims. And it's very likely that there were human remains of prisoners that were actually sacrificed in this island. They just weren't recovered. And now, again, the wonderful preservation that contributed not just to these guano's great fertilizing properties, but also the wood to preserve for so long. And we have those in the collection, two of those.
One question, I mean, that's all the stories, also what you working on, super interesting, super fascinating. I have more like a kind of question for how you would basically label what you do. So would you say what you are doing here, specifically also with these kind of collections, so will maybe then be on display in the new permanent exhibition, is provenance research? Are you doing provenance research? So provenance research is kind of a hot topic especially in Germany right now, but so it would be just interesting how you see basically what you are doing and how you would label it.
I would label it as also provenance research. I think I'm doing archaeology. I think I'm doing history. The artifacts themselves, I'm considering them within their broader context in a way that cannot be narrowed down to one thing, right? And that's perhaps the richest part and the most rewarding part of this work, is that the very activities that I do every day cannot be limited necessarily to any one discipline. So I would say I'm doing provenance research, but I am not only doing provenance research.
Yeah, we are here at the Zwischenraum, and I mean, you talked about it at the beginning, but you will also have a little exhibition here in the gray cube of the Zwischenraum, so our experimental space for little exhibitions, and your exhibition will also be pretty experimental regarding at least the way what you will present. Can you talk a little bit about this planned exhibition here in the Zwischenraum next June, right?
Yeah. Yes, next June this exhibition is going to be on some of the forgeries that are in the collection, in the Andean collection. These are most of these objects came in the 19th century, in the 1880s and 90s, and we don't know much about them, right? There's very little documentation. They don't really resemble any one artifactual tradition. And also, it's very interesting how many of them are. It's an important number. And it's not uncommon for museums like the MARKK to have forgeries. It's just that they're never brought forward. It's one of those things that you put in a box in your storage unit and don't think much about it because it's not an antiquity or an archaeological artifact or an ethnographic object, right? Now, the idea behind this exhibition is to turn that on its head and put these forgeries forward and ask the very same questions we ask of all the other artifacts, and so that we can figure out what kind of story they tell, right? So if we're wondering who made the artifacts that are in the permanent exhibit, well, why don't we ask the same questions? Who made these forgeries? How did they get here, right? When were they made and how were they made? And they are going to tell us a story about their context and about our collections as well.
Super interesting. Yeah. So for the last question, we thought that, okay, we are here in the Zwischenraum and we're thinking a lot about repositioning here, about what we are doing here for a kind of a renewed museum. And so the last question in this kind of series of podcasts we're producing should always be linking to what does repositioning mean to you. So what does repositioning mean to you in your daily work in the context of a MARKK fellowship, but also in your research, but also more broadly here in the Zwischenraum for the museum, for ethnographic museums maybe. So yeah, what does repositioning mean to you?
Repositioning is a question that tackles individuals and institutions and their broader social context, right? So it requires that curators are asking more critical questions of themselves, of their authority. The same for the museum, right? To become a more inclusive place, to reposition itself within its community and really figure out what kind of engagement with individuals it wants to have, right? How are these stories told? And actually, I think an important part of this whole process is to ask questions that are difficult, right? So, in the case, for example, of guano, well, it's not just these cool wooden figures that came out of these islands, but the fact that there's environmental degradation, that there's laborers working under dubious conditions as well, correct? There's ravaging capitalism affecting every aspect of social life that it intersects with in the guano trade, and centering that as part of the problematic of the work that we're presenting.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much for listening to our podcast series and Mafi for coming here, and the Federal Cultural Foundation for financing this podcast and the Mark in Motion program. Vielen Dank und bis bald.
Tschüss.